thank you all for coming on such a nice day with all of what other parts of the country are going through. I'll just say we had a nice day and leave it at that so that no karma comes around on us. Thanks for joining us. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West for our third lecture of the semester. If you're not on our mailing list, please drop your email on the list outside or pick up our printed schedule of lectures and events. We hope to see you at future ones. We're always pleased to welcome back Carol Graham to campus, and Carol's had a very busy week already, and I look forward to hearing her tell us about some very interesting news she's had working on a project with a UNLV graduate student. But she's going to build on her work that she's talked to us about in previous visits and delve into information technology and well-being surveys. And she's an accomplished economist among her many skills, so you're going to see a great number of graphs and charts and data before you hurt yourselves trying to take notes. We already have her PowerPoint up on our Brookings Mountain West website, so if you look under, ironically for the moment, past lectures, you will see Carol's lecture at the top of that list and the PowerPoint, and in a few days you'll actually see the video of this lecture. So I'm going to turn it over to Carol so we can get started, and I'll be back when we have time for some Q&A at the end of her talk. Carol?
Thanks, Bill. It is indeed always a pleasure to be here, and particularly because I got out of DC yesterday right before it started snowing, so I missed, I think, our third storm of the season. So it's awfully nice to be in 70 degrees and sunny. Anyway, yeah, Bill wanted me to mention one of the things that we've been trying to achieve with this partnership between Brookings and UNLV is sort of real collaboration between some students and our scholars. And I had the pleasure of working with a master's student here, Sarah Crown, who came out to work with my team and our data this summer for a couple of weeks. And we just published an article in the International Journal of Wellbeing, which is quite well-known journal in the well-being literature, and we were looking at religion and well-being around the world. So it's a great piece, and it was a real pleasure to sort of get our partnership to produce something tangible. So today I'm talking about technology and not religion, though. So basically, we've been using this new science of measuring well-being to look at the well-being effects of all sorts of different things. And it really is a very new science. Until about 5 years ago, I was one of a very small number of seemingly crazy economists that was using happiness surveys. And I was surely the only one that worked on developing countries from around the world. Today, there's remarkable interest in the topic. And that momentum reflects the work of many academics, increasingly using the surveys, showing that they're robust. The way people answer these well-being surveys are actually validated by psychological measures of well-being. There's even new work with medical doctors looking at genes, and it turns out that happier people or people with higher levels of well-being actually have certain gene alleles that carry more serotonin. So we can even verify that the way people answer these surveys is actually also validated in the medical arena. So a lot of academic work has gone into developing this novel little new science, and at the same time it's now been launched deep into the policy arena, and there are governments around the world that are now putting well-being metrics into their national statistics. The UK has already well-being metrics in its national statistical survey, the equivalent of their census, and have worked very closely with their team. The OECD has issued guidelines for governments around the world. If they're going to use these statistics, this is the way you should incorporate them into your national indicators. And we even have a National Academy of Sciences panel for the US, which I'm a part of, and we are tasked with recommending which of these metrics should be in our statistics. So I think we can imagine a world in the next 5 years where when we look at, maybe 10 years, when we look at GNP data and get GNP reports and unemployment stats and other things, we'll also be getting well-being statistics, time trends, what's happened across different cohorts, across different states in the US. So it's really there's been tremendous momentum. And the well-being measurement, I think, is now really a whole new approach in the social sciences. And what's nice about it is that we can answer questions that are the very diverse questions we can't answer easily with traditional economic methods. Questions like the effects of commuting time on well-being, why cigarette taxes make smokers happier, and indeed that is the case. A very contradictory finding from standard economics. I'm happy to answer more about that in the questions. Why the unemployed are less unhappy when there are more unemployed people around them, and why people adapt to things like crime and corruption and bad governance and still report to be at least relatively happy. So one reason is that this method captures a lot of things that standard revealed preferences approaches don't answer. So economists basically say you can't believe, the standard story was, you can't believe what people say in surveys. There's no consequence to what people say. They can say anything. So that's not credible data. You can only believe the data that's in people's revealed choices, in their consumption choices. And that works for a lot of questions. But we've also realized that often behavioral economics has shown that people make very perverse consumption choices. Consumption choices are often very irrational. People will buy a coffee mug for $4 and they won't sell it for less than 15 because they own it. Or they'll drive 20 miles and waste a ton of gas to save to save 20 cents on toilet paper rolls. There's a lot about consumption that isn't always rational. There's also consumption that is due to norms, addiction, or self-control problems, such as smoking, other things like that. So we can actually look at those behaviors and understand their welfare effects better through surveys. And as I noted, there is now increasing confidence that this survey data is actually quite robust. And the metrics are particularly good for looking at the welfare effects of macro and institutional arrangements individuals are powerless to change. So we can look at things like the effects of the financial crisis on well-being, the effects of inequality on well-being, things that individuals can't really change or reveal a choice, but those arrangements may really affect their happiness or their well-being. And then we can always look at behaviors. We also look at behaviors that are driven not by optimal choices, but by norms, addiction, and self-control problems, such as lack of choice by the poor due to strong norms or low expectations, and looking at the welfare effects of things like obesity, smoking, and other public health challenges. So the world is our oyster in lots of ways, and our most recent application is looking at access to information technology around the world, and does it have well-being effects, or does it have other kinds of effects? Before I get to that, I just want to say a couple quick things about well-being measurement so that when I show you the results, it makes a little more sense. There's really a clear distinction now being made between two dimensions of well-being. One is hedonic and one is evaluative. And I always pose this, and there's a chapter in my most recent book that says, should Bentham or Aristotle be in the Census Bureau? So Bentham thought about well-being as the contentment of the greatest number of people as possible as they experience their daily lives. That's hedonic well-being. Aristotle thought of well-being in a sense of the capacity to lead a fulfilling life, eudaimonic well-being. And that falls under evaluative well-being, which includes basically people's ability. You ask people how satisfied they are with their life as a whole, an example of an evaluative question. They're thinking about their whole life, and that includes their ability to make choices, to live the kind of lives they want to lead, to have purposeful or meaning lives if that's what they want. Hedonic well-being is very much about daily experience, how you experience your life today. Hedonic well-being has positive and negative dimensions, and we have to measure those separately. So we typically measure positive hedonic well-being with things like how often did you smile yesterday, and negative hedonic well-being with how often did you worry yesterday or how stressed were you yesterday. And psychologists stress that you can't assume that they're a continuum of each other. So with life evaluation, we know that 1 is a lot worse than 10 when you assess your life satisfaction on a 10-point scale. But you can't assume that somebody who smiled a lot yesterday didn't also worry a lot yesterday, right? So that we measure those things separately. Now, somebody who was angry a lot yesterday, worried a lot yesterday, and stressed a lot yesterday probably isn't a very happy person in the hedonic sense. So there are patterns, but we still measure these things separately. And as you'll see, they can play out quite differently in terms of things like when people make progress and make change or get access to information technology. So just quickly, one of the basic findings and big debates in economics now is about a seeming progress paradox, and progress paradox will come back to you as I discuss the technology results. This is something called the Easterlin paradox, the first modern economist to study happiness or well-being in the mid-70s, found that as countries grew wealthier over time, they didn't necessarily get happier. Average levels of happiness didn't necessarily increase with average per capita GDP. Japan, for example, quintupled its income in 3 decades, and average happiness levels fell. The US had the most rapid growth of any OECD economy until 2001, and average happiness levels were flat for several decades. And if you look across countries at any point in time, you don't get a clear relationship. Now you could conclude from this slide that there is no Easterlin paradox because the wealthy countries are on average happier than the poor ones. There's not that much, but there's no clear relationship among the wealthy countries between income and happiness, and there's even less of one. The poor countries are all over the map, right? This is per capita GDP, this is percent above neutral on life satisfaction, and you can see, for example, I'm from Latin America, it's a great place to live, cheerful people, and the Latin American countries are generally higher than their income levels would predict, because per capita income is also picking up other things like democracy, public goods, quality of life. And those are higher in these poor countries that are relatively happy. Then there are also countries that aren't so poor, Bulgaria, Romania, but that have kind of lower happiness levels than their income would predict because there are a lot of things that aren't that great about living there. And then there are the countries with no democracy and lots of violence, way at the bottom, Belarus, Iraq, Pakistan, Tanzania. Now, these average country comparisons are a little bit messy because you're not controlling for a lot of country-level unobservables, including country-level, cultural differences in the way people answer surveys. So, for example, if you look at France, it's sort of well below most of the wealthier countries because there's a certain pride and curmudgeonliness. My grandmother was from Paris, and you did not walk around Paris saying, "Have a nice day," right? But then I had a British friend who got so tired of hearing people in the US say, "Have a nice day," she started saying, "Thank you, I have other plans." So there are real differences in the way people just respond to surveys that get caught up in these metrics too. And where we're really much more robust is at the individual level, where we literally have hundreds of thousands of respondents from many countries and over time, and we control for the country they live in, the year that you happen to survey, all kinds of things, and all of their socioeconomic and demographic traits, and then look at how happiness levels or well-being levels vary. This is an amazing relationship that holds everywhere we've studied this. It's a relationship between happiness and age. This is for Latin America, but I've done this all over the world, most recently in Mongolia. I just finished the first well-being survey of Mongolia. The U-shaped age curve holds. It holds even for Afghanistan. So there's this, the low point on the happiness curve is somewhere in the middle age years. It's about 44 for the US, about 47 for Latin America. It's 50 for Russia, which is basically the life expectancy for Russian males. So I guess it's just the women that get happier after that. But so this is, the middle age years are double burden years, financial burdens, often dependent kids, dependent parents. There's an aspirations aligning with realities effect. If you don't figure out what you're going to be when you grow up by about 46 or 47, you probably should. And then what happens is people actually get happier as they age. This is controlling for health and controlling for being in a stable partnership. And this is also confirmed by a lot of psychological studies that people get happier as they age. There's also selection bias here because happier people live longer, so the less happy people die off in the sample. And then finally, there might even be a senility effect because our oldest respondent here is 99, but I won't belabor that. But anyway, in addition to this very stable age pattern across countries all over the world and over time, there are other things that are just remarkably stable in the determinants of happiness. One is income. So income really does matter within countries. More and more income doesn't buy you more and more happiness. But having enough means is important because it gives you choices in life, the ability to lead the kind of lives you want to lead. And we find that in the data. Health also matters. Health matters more than income to happiness. Stable employment, married people or people in stable partnerships are happier than those that aren't. A couple more things, friendships, a few more things, but we have these very stable patterns in the data. And because of that, we control for the things that we know hold across everybody, and we can look at the effects of things that vary. In this case, we're asking, what about technology? There's been this explosion of information technology around the world. It clearly has brought progress in lots of ways. Does it make people happy? It could go either way. So we've had a huge exponential growth. And now information technology is really key to economic progress in today's global economy. It provides connectivity, information agency, right? The ability to make phone calls anywhere you are, be on your email, do financial transactions. But like all development-related challenges, there are some progress paradoxes. First of all, just to give you a sense of how much technology has contributed to growth, in the OECD countries, a 10 percentage point increase in broadband penetration resulted in over 1% GDP growth from 1996 to 2007. That's huge across the whole OECD. And in Europe, we see, again, about a half a percentage point growth of GDP due simply to broadband infrastructure over 5 years. So why does this occur? Well, you get access to information, you get communications capacity. There's also a new ability to access financial services through information technology. This is incredibly important in places like Africa, where people don't have normal bank accounts. They don't have normal access to financial transactions or to cash machines. And now they're doing it all on cell phones. So you've had a whole creation of a new kind of financial sector in Africa through cell phone technology. In Kenya, there are 18 million mobile money users. 75% of the Kenyan population can now make financial transactions on their cell phone. So this is really transformative, from a development perspective and a progress perspective. And this is when what I mean when I say that, this is providing new capabilities. It's giving people capabilities to do things they couldn't otherwise do. Think about being a poor person in Africa. You get paid in cash. You don't have a bank account. You don't have an ability to make financial transactions. You want to take money to your starving mother, or you want to just, take your money home from your office to your work. You've got to take 2 crime-ridden, crowded bus rides, carrying cash, whatever else it might be. Your odds of getting your cash stolen are large. It's very cumbersome. And all of a sudden, instead, you can do everything on your cell phone. So it's huge. Also, in a lot of Africa and a lot of Latin America, poor people don't have access to landlines, to telephone lines. They never will. The companies have absolutely no incentive to put landlines in place in very poor places, right? So say you have, you want to get a job and you see a job advertisement in the paper. Well, you have no way of calling to answer the job advertisement, right? All of a sudden you have a cell phone. You can, so they're real. These are things that really have effects on people's ability to thrive economically. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of low-income versus high-income countries. As you can see, in almost every dimension of information technology, fixed landlines, mobile phones, internet, and broadband, the pink countries, the low-income countries, get an even greater economic growth effect from access to technology because their marginal, the marginal benefits are greater because they start from a much lower point, right? So there are positive effects of information technology on economic growth around the world, but they're even more important for poor countries. To give you another example, this is sub-Saharan Africa. These are landlines. Look at this. Nobody has a land telephone line. Internet is still very low penetration, although going up a little bit. Television is a little better. But look at cell phones. Look at the explosion in cell phone access in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is going to be a big part of the story I'm going to tell you. This is access to landlines and cell phones by region. Again, you'll see Sub-Saharan Africa, almost no landlines. South Asia, the poorest regions in the world just don't have landlines. So actually, when we did our analysis, we limited it to cell phones, internet, and television, because landlines, the access is just too uneven. This is access to internet and television by region. As you can see, internet penetration, which is internet access in your home. That doesn't mean that you can't access it by cell phone, but in your home, is very low, again, in the poor regions, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. This is Eastern Europe, and Latin America is a little better, but also quite low. So there's very much, having internet in your home is very much something that's more common in wealthy countries. Again, so you can see why getting this access via other technologies is very important. Just to give you a sense of what people use cell phones for, text messages, you all know when you're next to somebody that can't stop texting, people text a lot. Take pictures and then access the internet. So there's quite a bit of accessing the internet on your cell phone, right? So what we asked in this paper, which is now published if anybody wants a copy, is what are the well-being effects of this explosion in access to information technology around the world? What's the relationship between well-being and capabilities and agency, right? So does acquiring capabilities and agency have an effect on well-being? And do the effects vary across these two well-being dimensions? Is it sort of a positive daily experience effect, or is it really kind of you have more ability to lead the life you want, the kind of life you want to lead? And so we had some priors or some thoughts that what did we think would happen with access to information technology? Well, we felt that it would have, in the positive hedonic well-being category, that there would be positive effects. It would simplify daily tasks. It would help with job searches. It would help with communication with your family, particularly if you were remote or in deprived areas. E-banking, mentioned that already, and it would reduce, sort of poor people's lack of information in a lot of ways. We also thought that in terms of evaluative well-being, that there'd be some sort of empowerment effect, right? You're giving people capabilities and access to information. There's an empowering element to that. There'd be more possibilities for people to be active, to answer job advertisers, and that you could conduct financial transactions. These are ways in which we thought there'd be positive effects. But then we also thought, it might also increase negative hedonic well-being. It's making life a lot more complicated. It might increase stress and anger. It introduces change and complexity and new information, maybe too much new information. All of you know what that's like, to be sort of overloaded by technology. And there are some indications in some other studies that this explosion in social media and internet-based technologies have resulted in less actual social interactions, which we know is bad for well-being. So we have a pretty amazing data set that I'm involved in. I'm an advisor to the Gallup World Poll. It's an annual survey run from 2005 till today. It conducts surveys of about 1,000 respondents in 140 countries in the world. I think it's now even up to more than that. I think it's now up to 160 countries. And it's not, we can't follow the same people over time because that's much too expensive to do, but we can pool the years. So it's a huge number of observations. They ask both by telephone in places where landline penetration is complete. Otherwise, the interviews are done face-to-face. So in most of the poorest countries, the interviews are actually done face-to-face. Whole bunch of questions from household income to attitudes about democracy to how much do you socialize, to these well-being questions, some employment questions. In addition, we have the Global Findex database from the World Bank, which is looking at, it's got questions about the use of mobile phones to pay bills, to send or receive payments, to make financial transactions. So we were able to look specifically at the effects of e-banking. Okay, and then we have these well-being measures, the questions we use. From the evaluative question we use is the Cantrell ladder on the best possible life. It's a question that asks the respondent to think about the best possible life they can imagine, and then how does their life compare to that best possible life, and to place themselves on a 10-point scale. Then we ask, for positive hedonic well-being, we ask, did you smile a lot yesterday? Yes or no? And these hedonic questions were actually developed by Danny Kahneman, the first psychologist to get the Nobel Prize in economics, who's also, I work very closely with him in Gallup and on the National Academies panel, but he basically says these questions are as good as the very detailed psychological questions that he got the Nobel Prize for developing. So these very simple questions work very well in tracking these positive and negative affect. Then we asked, did you experience stress yesterday? Yes or no? And did you experience anger yesterday? Because stress and anger actually are slightly different emotions. And the questions we asked was, do you have a landline, a cell phone, a television, and access to the internet? But we really focused on, as I mentioned before, cell phones, TV, and internet. Don't worry about this. This is just the equations that we use, but it helps me remember what to say, so don't get bogged down in it. But basically we're saying what we do is we have all these hundreds of thousands of observations, and for each individual in country X, so we control for the country they're in year, whatever year the question was asked, so we make sure there's no bias because of the year it was asked. So the well-being of that individual, and do they own a landline? Do they own a cell phone? Do they have TV? Do they have internet? And then we control for all these things that I mentioned that are consistent patterns: age, income, education, employment status, rural, urban, everything else, so that we can really isolate the actual well-being effects of these different technologies. So, just to give you some summary statistics, one thing that we find, particularly with this best possible life question, but with all evaluative measures, that here you get more of a correlation between rich people or being richer or being in a rich country and having higher evaluative scores, because more money doesn't buy more and more happiness, but having enough money, having enough means gives you the capacity to make choices in your life. So evaluative scores are usually slightly higher in wealthier places. This is the world average on the best possible life. So you can see Europe scores high, Australia, New Zealand, North America, primarily the US and Canada, and then sub-Saharan Africans lower. The poorer countries are slightly lower on this. So there's a little bit of an income and well-being pattern here. But when we look at smiling and the hedonic variables, you get a very different story. There's the green bars are smiling, as you can see. People smile plenty in poor places too. And the other thing we find is that stress is quite a bit higher in the wealthier economies. So look, this is North America. So we smile a lot here, but we're also very stressed. We have the highest levels of stress of any region. The Middle East also has very high levels of stress, and they smile less, so don't go there. And then you can see, that there's a lot lower stress. Europe has lower stress. Where's Latin America? Latin America's got much lower stress than North America. Sub-Saharan Africa also lower. Part of that changes. That reflects the progress paradox, right? Because the poorer the region, life is also slightly, there may be more poverty, but there are less complexities in some ways. So, again, don't worry about the equations. It just it reminds me what to say. So here, this is where we're just showing, what determined who has these technologies, cell phone, internet, and TV. And it's very clear there that people who are in more stable homes, right, married people, people with higher levels of education than high school, higher household income, full-time employment, and urban people, no surprise, all are more likely to have access to these technologies. Okay, well here's where we sort of have some real results. And again, this is controlling for all these other things. What are the isolated effects of each of these technologies? And so this first column is the best possible life. That's evaluative well-being, then smiling, then stress, and then anger. And as you can see, these are the general results for a worldwide sample, right? All of the technologies, landline, cell phone, internet, TV, are associated with higher levels of evaluative well-being and higher levels of smiling yesterday. So there's a clear positive effect. They're also associated with lower levels of stress and anger across the board. So the sort of overall story is access to information technology probably makes life better. It makes a lot of things easier. But do the effects vary? Do the effects vary where the technologies are new and have, make more of a difference to people's lives or not? So here we get quite different results. We broke this up by regions, right? Poor and wealthy regions in the world, and did the exact same messy equations. Then we find out that there are some quite large differences. So for example, access to TV and access to cell phone have very positive correlation with evaluative well-being in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. The biggest effect is in these areas because it really makes a difference to people's capabilities to function. Instead, both TV and cell phones had insignificant effects on well-being in the wealthy regions. Well, why is that? Think about it. We know from other studies that people who watch a lot of TV are less happy than people that watch less TV or don't watch TV at all, because there's sort of a social anomie effect, right? We're bombarded with television and technology, and people probably watch too much of it, versus if you live in Africa and you just got a TV, you're working so many hours. If you're lucky, you watch, half an hour of TV a day, whenever it happens to be on, and that's kind of a luxury. It's a nice thing. But in wealthy places, a lot of TV is actually negatively associated with well-being. And cell phones, again, there's just kind of an overload with information technology. Internet plays out slightly differently. It's positive across the world. So then we tried to tease this out a little further. These are sort of the same, our main results, but then we look at having a cell phone and having household income that's over $10,000 a year. So these are wealthier respondents. And we look at internet access and household income of over $10,000 a year. So this is really wealthy people in wealthy countries, right? Here we find that if you're wealthy and you have these things, the positive effect is actually kind of mitigated. It's negative here on both smiling and on, so cell phone and internet has a negative effect. It doesn't totally get rid of the positive effect, but it makes a positive effect less if you're wealthy, because you already have a lot of these things. Same goes for smiling. It actually, it's negative again. And then you actually get an increase in both stress and anger for all of the technologies for people that have a lot of them. And you can, I think as we've been overloaded with technology, and you see, you're surrounded by people that are on their phone or on the, iPad or on this or on that, and you're just bombarded with emails and cell phone calls. You can see that phenomena happening, and it plays itself out very robustly in the data across hundreds of thousands of respondents around the world. So that's sort of a progress paradox of its own. One of the things we thought might be a possible channel in the positive effects of these technologies was learning. Maybe technologies are giving people, particularly people in the poorer context where they're new, a chance to learn something new. Whether it's, they're getting a lot of new information they didn't otherwise have. And indeed, we find that there's a question in Gallup that says, did you learn or do something interesting yesterday? And if you have access to any of these technologies, it's positively correlated with responding that you learned or did something new yesterday. So there is a possible learning channel. But again, learning can go lots of ways. So here's another thing we did is we looked at mobile banking. So I've talked a lot about how great it is that people can now make financial transactions, right? They couldn't make them before, but now they can. So what we were able to do, we didn't have actual individual access on each individual's access to mobile banking, but there's a huge variability in the countries that have introduced mobile banking and not. So the countries that have introduced mobile banking, like Kenya, have 75% of people with mobile banking versus countries that don't have that, so we split it up into countries with mobile banking and not. And it turns out that in addition to the other effects of the technologies, that if you have access to mobile banking, you have positive effects on evaluative well-being and smiling yesterday, but very strong positive effects on stress and anger. So all of a sudden, life gets more complicated, right? You can make these financial transactions on your cell phone, your life is better, you have new capabilities, but all of a sudden, life gets more complicated, and that increases stress and anger. And if you go back to this slide, where you see that stress is higher in places that are a little more developed and have more, that life is more complicated. So that's very much the progress paradox that has run through a lot of this work. Now, you always have to be careful about any study like this and say, well, maybe, there are other things besides my results driving the results. Maybe, there could be some. So one thing we always worry about is causality, because since we're not following people over time, we only have one observation. You always worry about reverse causality. So for example, we often find in these big surveys that married people are happier than non-married people. Well, it turns out it's not because of marriage at all. It's that happier people are more likely to marry each other. So when you look over time at the same people, the effect of marriage lasts about a year, and then all you're picking up in the data is the fact that happier people were more likely to marry each other. So it turns out there's a friend of mine in France did this wonderful study called "You Can't Be Happier Than Your Wife," and it shows that the probability of divorce is highest when you have asymmetries in happiness levels. So if you have a happy person married to an unhappy person, it's the worst thing possible. Better to have two unhappy people married to each other. But a happy person, unhappy person drive each other crazy, right? But the point is, you have to be careful about causality. So the only way to reverse this question is say that, it isn't that access to information technology is having effects on well-being. If that ran the other way, you'd have to assume that happier people are more likely to acquire information technology. And I feel pretty comfortable dismissing that as not really a possibility. I just don't think there's anything that suggests that happier people would be more likely to acquire information technology. So I really do think that the effects run from information technology access to well-being. I think most of the objective measures of the benefits of these technologies, as I showed you, are about economic growth and productivity. We don't really know enough about how they affect individuals. This is just a first look, so we may be picking up or not picking up some things. And then finally, one of the things that you also need to worry about is different interview survey modes. So in the UK, when they implemented their well-being statistics in their, the equivalent of their census, they tried out two survey modes. Some people were asked, answered the surveys by telephone, and some people answered in person. And so our priors were that people would be less likely to admit they were miserable in person, right? That there would be sort of a pride effect, and that the in-person interviews would be biased upwards, and the telephone interviews would be more likely to be actual. Turned out to be the opposite. People in person were very happy to go on about how miserable they were, and all the in-person interviews were actually biased downwards. Well, the problem we have in our survey, of course, is that you have in-person interviews in the poor countries where people don't have landlines, and then you had telephone interviews in the wealthier context that had a lot of landlines. The one thing is, because we can control, all of the surveys are done exactly the same in each country, and we control for country level errors, we hope we're getting beyond that. But in any event, the point of all this is just to say, to the extent we feel confident that these results are real results, I think we've tried to control for anything that could possibly be biasing them. So what about what do we take away from all of this? Well, in general, I think it's hard to argue that information technology is anything other than generally positive for well-being. It's just introduced a lot of positive things and capabilities that we didn't have before, and it shows up around the world, and the positive effects are particularly pronounced in poor countries where these things are new and people can't afford 15 different iPads and cell phones and having they're likely to have one phone or one. But we also do find increases in stress and anger, and I think that's precisely because, well, there are lots of reasons. One is the technology overload, I think that we find in the US and Europe. But in these poorer contexts, I think some of the stress and anger comes from, it's something I found looking at development processes from many other different angles, is that, I've known in the literature for something called the happy peasant and frustrated achiever problem, which is, we find these very poor respondents with limited means, limited information who report to be very happy, and then compare them to respondents who are making upward gains in income, lots of upward mobility, who are very frustrated with their economic situation and their lives, even though they've doubled or quintupled their income. And I think that's precisely because as people start to move up the income ladder, they acquire more information about how the rest of the world lives, about how what they have compares to the rest of the world. And that can produce a lot of frustration and anger. I mean, we do a lot of work looking at what reference groups do people, who do people compare themselves to? Well, poor rural people tend to compare, if you ask them about their household financial situation, they'll compare their harvest this year to their harvest last year. They may compare it to their neighbor, but their neighbor's farming the same stuff. There's not much variance. Versus if you ask urban people, their reference group becomes their city, right? And then it becomes very wealthy people. And as people acquire more information about the rest of the world, that can produce a lot of stress and anger. And cell phones and information technology, the internet, people in one click know exactly what's going on in Las Vegas or wherever it might be, even if they're sitting in Mali. So life becomes more complicated with all of this new information. And it fits with, we've been doing some work on the political protests around the world in recent years. And rather ironically, protests don't usually happen in places just because of stagnant poverty. They happen in places that are changing and growing. And if you look at the protests around the world in the recent years, they're in the best performing middle income countries. Students in Chile, on the streets in Chile, people protesting the health system in Brazil. Brazil's the fastest growing economy in Latin America right now. In Russia, which has been growing very fast, people protesting corruption in governance. In Turkey, in Thailand, in Ukraine, we looked at the actual sociodemographic traits of these protesters, and they're mainly middle-aged. They're not crazy teenagers. They're middle income. They're not poor. And they have higher levels of education than the average, and yet they're out protesting. And why is that? Because their expectations are now, they want to be middle class and have some sort of decent public institutions, decent middle class life. And they're living in contexts where the institutional structures aren't that good, and they're well aware of how bad the institutional structures. We have these related findings from Latin America where we find that poor people are more likely to trust Parliament, the presidency, the judiciary, and the courts, but less likely to trust the police. Wealthy people are much less likely to trust, the judiciary, the courts, and the presidency or the parliament, and more likely to trust the police. Why is that? The only institution that poor people really have access to and know is the police. So they know they're corrupt. They have no access to or real information about these larger scale institutions. Wealthy people know about the corruption in the other institutions, and therefore they don't trust them. So again, there's this kind of, as people learn, as they get more information, there's some stress and anger sometimes at just realizing that things you thought would work a certain way don't work a certain way. So we also find with its positive effect that there are really diminishing marginal returns for people that already have a lot of information technology, and that there can be kind of a negative effect from information overload. We show that in the data. I think there's probably going to be, over time, some sort of, I don't want to say reversal, but I think at some level we may find that people back off from being so plugged into technology. I'm not sure, right? But I think there could be, where we've got so much technology, there could start to be some sorts of efforts to sort of say, and there are places that already do that, sort of, have some time in the day that you're not plugged into anything, you're not on your cell phone, or you're simply playing music, or you're simply reading, or you're simply writing, but you're not. I don't know, but that's a possibility. The learning channel is very important. Obviously, these technologies are positively associated with learning, and they facilitate it, but they also, the learning can help explain the stress and anger findings, as I just mentioned. Mobile banking, again, a great boon to poor people in Africa, but it's making their life more complicated. Again, a progress paradox. Another thing I think that's quite important when we think a lot about whatever these information technologies are doing to reduce poverty or to help with productivity or to introduce new capabilities, they can't substitute for development. You can't give a lot of poor people with really lousy educations cell phones and expect some magical result, right? These technologies are complementary to all of the other important drivers of economic growth, and investments in human capital is a huge part of that. And these regions, these poor regions that we're looking at, still are very lacking in those things. So I think the productivity contribution that information technology makes is delimited by those other very important investments. And as I mentioned before, these findings fit into this broader pattern in our research that shows that the process of acquiring agency and capabilities, of moving from poverty into the middle class, of trying to go from subsistence, day-to-day living where life is, you don't really have control over your life, you just survive from day to day, to a life where you have the capacity to make choices, to lead a fulfilling life, if you'd like to the pursuit of happiness in the Jeffersonian and Aristotelian sense, that shift is actually a very painful and unhappy one. It's not, there are a lot of progress paradoxes, and there's a lot of frustration and stress and anger as people go from being happy peasants to frustrated achievers. And sometimes they then move on to be miserable millionaires, but that's the topic for the sequel. Anyway, I'll stop there. I don't know if there are any questions or...
Thank you. I'm sure we have some either happy or stressful questions. Does anyone want to get us started? We have a few minutes. Please, sir.
I was interested in the point you made about the places that are in revolt or places that are experiencing economic booms or increases, and it's the conflict or that doesn't really show up in China. After Tiananmen Square, I haven't heard much of any protests in
Life
China.
satisfaction in China has fallen dramatically. Maybe people are scared to protest since Tiananmen Square, but if you look at it's like a trend like this. Growth has reached unprecedented levels and life satisfaction has fallen. And the Chinese government is incredibly interested in happiness metrics for very self-interested reasons. So, there's very much a progress paradox in China. There's around the world, there's something I found called the paradox of unhappy growth, which is showing that these fast-growing places, typically, at least during the period of rapid growth, is associated with drops in well-being. And that's, I think, because it's full of progress paradoxes. There's a lot of change and uncertainty. Rewards are changing to different skill sets. It used to be if you finished high school, you could have a stable middle-class life in Latin America, for example, and that's now you need a higher education because of all the changes. Inequality often increases. Inequalities increase dramatically in China, and that produces unhappiness. And then there's just the uncertainty associated with it. And usually that levels out, and life satisfaction levels will recover once patterns get much more established. But China, it may be turning back now, but they had a very big negative dip in life satisfaction.
Anybody else before we depart for the evening? Great. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Carol. Hope you can join us. Yes, please. Hope you can join us next week. We'll be have another lecture on Wednesday evening next week. Colleague from Brookings will be out, Thomas Wright. Thomas, a foreign policy expert. He's going to take a look at the entire geopolitical landscape and look at the changing role of the U.S. and how its global mission might need to or have to change with some of these changes Carol was talking about. So hope we see you then.